Hey everybody, Marcus here. It is not uncommon to hear the term man up lodged against men. When we encounter this term, it can be observed that the reaction is to universally, condemn it. It is dismissed as shaming language and thought of nothing more. However, is it the case that there are men we encounter who, though male, seem to lack some quality by which we would feel justified in calling them men? In other words, is it true that we each encounter men who behave in such an unmanly way that we recoil in disgust and would feel ashamed to be such ourselves? Men to whom we would feel justified in telling to man up? Justified in the sense that we are not attempting to shame them in the way feminists and blue pillars do, but to shame them nonetheless into behaving more becoming of a man. Why, yes, these men exist, and we have each encountered them. There are many who would label the entire generation of millennial men to be this very kind of man I speak of. Let me ask you a question. Are there some acts which are shameful and acts which are not shameful? Well, there are. Ought someone feel shame having performed a shameful act, while someone who had not performed a shameful act ought not feel shame? Well, indeed, someone who performed a shameful act ought to feel shame, while a man having not performed a shameful act ought not feel shame. If this is true, then it follows that a man having performed a shameful act but himself not feeling shame must not know he has performed a shameful act, while otherwise he would be ashamed of the act. Now, Socrates, in his discourse on justice, put forward an argument as to the purpose of punishment. The purpose of punishment is medicinal. The criminal, Socrates says, will agree with the judge that indeed the guilty man ought to be punished, but that he himself is not guilty. For such a man, the punishment ought to take such a form as to remove his ignorance of his own guilt. Now, this may seem confusing, so let me explain. Imagine that there is a man who has a violent temper. Let us imagine that some act or word caused this man to strike his perceived transgressor. The angry man will feel he had committed a just act, as he feels he has exerted the correct reaction to his perceived slight. However, since the angry man suffers from a deficiency in fortitude, his emotional reactions were grossly disproportional to the perceived slight, as would be judged by a man who did possess the virtue of fortitude. As such, the angry man committed an injustice, but is himself ignorant that he has committed an injustice. Socrates would say that the angry man must be punished in such a way as to help cultivate the angry man's virtue of fortitude, so that he ultimately does come to see that he has committed an injustice. Well, too, in this way, the angry man, after experiencing his punishment, will be bettered for having undergone the punishment. The angry man will be more virtuous as a result of the punishment. So, if we are to continue the argument we began earlier in relation to shame, we must conclude that it is just to shame a man who has committed a shameful act, but does not feel shame. To not shame such a man would be unjust. The act of shaming such a man, in turn, would be medicinal and would lead to the man becoming more virtuous due to the shaming. So the question ahead of us becomes, which acts are shameful and which are not? More specifically, what is that quality or absence of that quality within those men who we feel disgust towards? What are these shameful acts some men commit which invoke in us a desire to tell them to man up? Well, firstly, we must establish the origins of the Western concept of manliness. Now, the Romans had a word for manliness, virtus. In Latin, vir means man, so in this way, virtus becomes manliness. Virtus carries with it the connotations of valor, excellence, courage, character, and worth. Virtus also translates to the English word virtue. In Greek, virtue is arete. Arete, as used by the Greeks, also means excellence. As the Romans were heavily influenced by Greek Stoic philosophy, we can safely include the four Greek cardinal virtues of justice, temperance, fortitude, and prudence into the mix. So in this way, manliness is synonymous with virtuousness. In turn, to be a man is to possess or pursue virtue. Let us look at some examples in which we judge a man needs to man up and how they relate to virtue. Take the example of a man who lets others walk all over him. Such a man is a coward. He lacks the virtue of courage, which in turn is subservient to fortitude. Surely, shaming such a man would be medicinal in nature, as he ought to be ashamed to allow himself to suffer such acts. In the opposite extreme, take the example of a man who picks fights with opponents far larger and stronger than himself, only to find he gets his ass kicked. This man, in turn, also lacks courage, as he is enacting reckless abandon. Courage can be found between the one extreme of cowardice and the other extreme of reckless abandon. So this man too ought to be shamed for his behavior, as he is not acting like a man. He is not acting virtuously. What about the man that gets stinking drunk so frequently that it begins to affect his work? Is this someone acting manly? Well, surely not. He lacks the virtue of temperance. Shaming him would also be appropriate. What about the man who joins his friends in the pub for rounds, but always leaves just before his turn comes up to buy the round? Well, this man is acting unjustly, and indeed shaming him too would be the just action. You see, if you shame the man who skips out when his round comes up, one of two things will happen. Either he starts to pay his way, or he stops joining his friends at the pub. If he starts paying his way, then it can be supposed that he simply was not aware he was acting unjustly, as perhaps he did not notice the effect occurring over time. However, if he stops joining his friends at the pub, then one of two things would be the case. In the first instance, he was gravely insulted, in which case, though he may or may not have been aware he was behaving unjustly, this man also suffers from a lack of fortitude, as he disproportionately reacted to the situation due to an emotional response. In the second instance, he was aware of the injustice and stopped attending when he realized he could no longer exploit the situation. In this case, shaming would seem to not have been the correct remedial action. In this case, an ass kicking would have been remedial. And yes, violence can be medicinal, as Aristotle would say, when applied at the right time, in the right way, for the correct duration, for the right reasons. But I think we have looked at enough examples for now. Let us now take a look at how man up is used by feminists and blue pillars. If you don't let a woman fleece you in family court, you need to man up. If you don't pay for raising some single mom's kids, you need to man up. If you get beaten by a woman and complain, you need to man up. Now, this list can go on. However, what do these examples, and I would argue almost all examples that feminists and blue pillars use, have in common? All these examples entail that the man ought to suffer an injustice. Earlier, we mentioned the example of the man who lets other people walk all over him. We said he is a coward, that he lacks the virtue of courage. Well, what feminists and blue pillars are saying is that the correct behavior for a man is cowardice. However, for a man to act cowardly is for him to act unmanly. The feminist and blue pillar use of the term man up is self-refuting. It is an analytic contradiction in terms. The concept manliness is mutually exclusive from the concept cowardice. To do as feminists and blue pillars say is to act unmanly. There is one example I would like to evaluate specifically in which feminists and blue pillars tell men to man up. If a man says he does not wish to get married because of the horrible marriage laws, he is told to grow a pair and man up. Now, I want to call out this example specifically because it will teach us something about the virtue of courage. Aristotle says that virtue is the golden mean between a privation and an excess. In the case of the virtue courage, the privation is cowardice and the excess is reckless abandon. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle clarifies that from the perspective of someone who is reckless, someone who is courageous seems like a coward. Let me clarify. Imagine you have two men sitting in a trench during a war. They each have run out of bullets for their rifles, and the only weapon they have is the bayonet attached at the end of their rifles. Both men see a tank approaching the trench. One man jumps out of the trench and charges the tank with his bayonet. The other man hides in the trench and hopes the tank just passes by. Now, the man who jumps out of the trench to charge the tank may think that the man who stayed in the trench is a coward. However, the man in the trench was indeed the courageous one. The man who jumped out of the trench to charge the tank was acting out of reckless abandon and not at all courageously. Throwing away your life is not courage. So, in this way, when blue pill men tell MGTOW to grow a pair and man up when they hear MGTOW choose not to get married, these blue pill men are talking from the perspective of reckless abandon. These blue pill men are the ones charging the tank with a bayonet, thinking that the MGTOW who stayed in the trench is a coward. But let us once again turn to those men who we legitimately look upon as unmanly and warrant shaming in a manner similar to the force with which the term man up is used. Most of these men we also typically call pussies. Yet here too, the term pussy is little more than a euphemism for cowardice. Indeed, these disgusting, unmanly men do need to man up, but in the way I have described here and not in the way feminists and blue pillars use the term. When these unmanly men kowtow to women, they are acting out of a lack of fortitude, out of fear, out of cowardice. They take pride in suffering and committing acts a man ought to be ashamed of, yet they feel no shame. They need to be corrected. They need to be shamed. It is just to shame them and unjust not to. But you cannot shame them with insults alone. Insults alone do not generate shame. Insults alone generate anger or amusement. Shame is generated by modeling virtue first, by modeling excellence. A fat woman will not feel shame by being called fat by a fat woman. However, she will feel shame by being called fat by a skinny woman. The skinny woman has demonstrated excellence in light of her skinniness. In this way, if the perception of a blue pillar is that MGTOW are losers, any insult coming from a MGTOW will be met with anger or perhaps even amusement. All methods of shaming work in a similar manner. Firstly, you must be perceived by your interlocutor as being above them in some way, as being an authority. In this way, an insult carries weight. However, if you are perceived as an authority, you do not need insults to begin with. You can shame others through disappointment. You can shame them by holding them to a higher standard than their current actions display. You can shame them with mere laughter. You can shame them with displays of anger. Hell, you can even shame them by telling them they should feel ashamed of themselves. These are all common modes of shaming that parents exert on their children. But the key to it all is perceived authority. MGTOW has no perceived authority. Within the MGTOW community, you will find a lot of complaining, criticizing, contending, comparing, and competing. These are what Stephen Covey referred to as the 5 emotional cancers. And there's the red pill rage as well. The MGTOW community, by its nature, is a male space that allows for the unleashing of all your past blue pill frustrations. You discover the red pill, you unleash your pent up frustrations, and eventually, well, most MGTOW attain some peace. However, as new men constantly join the MGTOW community, you will always have a current of negativity as these men work through the process. As such, there will never be a point where the community will be absent these phenomena. Due to this, the aggregate sum of all negativity within the community at any given time can easily be perceived as the state of each man in the community at all points in time. The consequence is that our community is not naturally predisposed to radiate virtue. However, there are 2 ways in which the MGTOW community can overcome this problem. The first case is economic. The wealthy men in this community need to flaunt their wealth in YouTube videos. Even middle-class men, in turn, can set up scenarios where wealth is perceived. The challenge is that it is a fine line to travel without doxing yourself. If indeed MGTOW gains a reputation of being populated by moneyed individuals, then industry will catch on, as will women, and slowly the narrative around MGTOW will shift from bitter loser virgins to misunderstood victims of left-wing politics or something like that. Also, videos with MGTOW in good physical shape would also go away to change perceptions. The second case is cultural. In this scenario, the MGTOW community needs to start producing cultural artifacts such as paintings, sculptures, literature, poetry, philosophy, research, music, films, cartoons, and so on. If sufficient artifacts are produced at a high quality and these artifacts break through to the mainstream, the perception of MGTOW will change from bitter loser virgins to eccentric artists. Some combination of the 2 cases listed above is also possible and would work well more effectively. However, I believe that the reason neither of the two cases mentioned before have naturally occurred is because of the strong desire for anonymity among the members of the community. Now, I do realize that there's a perceived fear among the community of showing their faces. What I'm not quite sure is if it is a justified fear. Though I have heard of doxing stories of members of the community, I have not heard a single story where such a doxing had any negative effects on the person in real life. No Holds Barred started showing his face, and so far he has not been crushed by feminists. I believe that the need for complete anonymity was a necessary condition perhaps 5 years ago, but today, with the rise of the anti-feminist community and the general anti-SJW zeitgeist of our time, it might be time to rethink this paranoia that we will lose our jobs due to some angry SJW on the internet. Anyways, I want to close off this video by saying that indeed, there are men who need to man up out there. However, the term man up has been irretrievably tarnished through its use by feminists and blue pillars. If you guys have any ideas for a term that appropriately captures the sentiment I express in this video, then please leave a comment. Thanks for listening. Go team.